Sunday Baroque Conversations is made possible by the Friends of Sunday Baroque and is produced at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm Suzanne Bona. Thanks for listening. Don't miss an episode of Sunday Baroque Conversations. Subscribe on Apple, Google, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a review. If you want to find out where you can listen to our weekly show, visit our website, sundaybaroque.org, for a station list and our 24/7 stream. Again, that's sundaybaroque.org. Eric Rice is a musicologist and conductor. He is head of the music department at the University of Connecticut, where he teaches music history and directs the Collegium. And full disclosure, UConn is my alma mater. Professor Rice was the 2019 recipient of Early Music America's Thomas Binkley Award for Excellence in Performance and Scholarship. The Columbia University and Bowdoin College graduate, also directs Ensemble Origo. Eric Rice joins me on Zoom to talk about his work as an early music scholar and performer. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
So you're a specialist in a very specific era of music, but I'd like to back it up a little bit and hear about how you found your way to it. What was your original start in music?
I was one of those people who was always in choir growing up and never thought that I would be a musician professionally or specialize in it. And I got to college and I dutifully joined the chamber choir and thought I would be an English major and do a lot of theater. I wanted to be a theatrical lighting designer, actually. Wow. And we went on a tour to Germany my first year in college, and I was sort of bitten by this bug of performing Renaissance music, liturgical music especially, in these great big churches, these cathedrals, and trying to get a little bit of an understanding of the context of this music really sort of made me feel like this sort of music is almost like time travel. It allows you to really think about the thoughts of people from hundreds of years ago and hear it in the way we hear music, in this very ephemeral, spiritual way, and have access to their thoughts. And I thought, I think maybe this is actually what I want to do.
Wow. So you changed your major.
I changed my major. I did an interdisciplinary major in English and music. And my thought was to think about the relationship of text and music, which of course is something I'm actively engaged with still. So it was a good start.
Right, right. So are you from a musical family, or was this an aberration?
I think it was more of an aberration. My mother grew up in Germany and she sang in choirs growing up. Post-war Germany was not a very happy place, or a very kind of, there wasn't a lot to do the way that she tells it. And so this was one of the things that kept her busy. And I think she did instill in me that love of music just through her own continuing to sing while I was growing up.
Okay. Now, so you have a cornetto on your desk behind you.
Right.
Do you play it, or is that just for show or for someone else?
I get students to play it.
Okay.
I am not an instrumentalist of really any kind. I've taken many different kinds of sort of intro to early music instrument lessons. And those are all just to help me give my Collegium students some starting points, so I'll take a viola da gamba, which is really tuned like a guitar and sort of looks like one, and I'll thrust it into a violinist's hands and I'll say, here, it's tuned in fourths, it has frets, figure it out. And so I'm really not, I'm not an instrumentalist. And I sang professionally for quite a while, doing, again, medieval Renaissance Baroque music, mostly liturgical music, in churches in New York City in particular, where I was in graduate school. But I haven't sung professionally now for about a decade. It's too hard to keep everything going.
So let's talk a little bit about Ensemble Origo, starting with what does the name mean?
So Origo is Latin for earliest beginning, origin, and it really draws out this idea that I have for the ensemble, that it's not, just another Renaissance choir or instrumental ensemble, but that we're really using programs to explore music's original contexts, to try to put a sort of a frame around a concert that we might give or a recording that we might make, to sort of say, this is something like the original context in which this music was produced and heard. This is what it meant to the people who first made it. And thereby, I hope we're doing a little bit of creative work in terms of performance, but we're also disseminating some research in terms of showing people how the music originally functioned.
Sure, sure. Now, your 2021 recording features music by Orlando di Lasso, and that was for the 1568 wedding of the Duke of Bavaria. So how does that tie into the mission of the group? And also, what's special about this particular music and this particular event in history?
Yeah, it ties in nicely in the sense that I decided that I wanted to sort of pursue this particular event, and the event itself was actually 18 days long. So
wow.
I had to pick and choose a little bit. I wasn't going to make an 18-day recording. What got me interested in this wedding was the genre of the Moresca, which is a name for a genre that represents Moors in music, and in particular, in the case of these particular Moresque, Black Africans. Mm-hmm. I wanted to understand, I performed these pieces in college. I wanted to understand what the context was in which they would be performed, because they were very strange, really, in comparison with a lot of other music from the period. And linguistically, they're very challenging. They have a lot of syllables that seem to be onomatopoetic utterances. It's Neapolitan dialect, so the Italian is quite hard to translate. And once I began digging into and figuring out how these things were actually used, it became clear that it was at this wedding that they were originally performed. And once that became clear to me, I decided, well, I need to, again, to sort of frame these pieces. I don't just want to make a recording of these 7 pieces and call it done. I want to show the full context. Mm-hmm. And that becomes pretty important, because the Moresque are caricatures, as I said, and there are other caricatures that go on in the music in the after party of this wedding as well. And so it's important to frame these, I would say, more racially charged representations and caricatures in light of the other caricatures that are going on in the mm-hmm. wedding. Mm-hmm. So there are 4 vignettes total. We start with a Te Deum, which is the way that the wedding ceremony actually ended. And it's quite a long piece. It's almost 16 minutes long in our performance. Alternates plain song and polyphony. And we added all kinds of instrumental colors to it, because it seems like the kind of thing that Lassus would have done. Mm. We then moved to a motet that was performed at supper a week later. And there's a description, I didn't mention this, of the wedding and its after party that goes into a lot of detail, mostly, unfortunately for us, about what people were wearing and what they ate. Nothing really new under the sun there. It was sort of reads like a society page or something. Mm-hmm. And so there is musical detail from time to time. And that musical detail told us that when this motet was performed, there were 3 sections. The middle section was performed by just 4 singers, one and a part. And everybody stopped eating because the music was so beautiful. Oh. And they sat there and they listened, according to the narrator, according to the description, with food in their mouths. They didn't even dare chew because they were listening to the music. So that was pretty striking. Mm. And then the third vignette is these Moresque, which were performed on one evening in the bridal chamber. So I thought that was quite interesting. Everybody troops up to the bridal couple's bedroom and listens to music for an hour. And the music is very, very sexual and scatological in terms of its text.
Wow.
So that caught my attention. And then there was an improvised comedy, what we now refer to as a commedia dell'arte, mm-hmm. that was performed over one evening. And Troiano, the guy who wrote the description, tells us about the instrumentation of the music, but he doesn't tell us exactly what the music is. But we can sort of tell from the characters in the story by looking at the surviving Lassus print that has all of this music in it, which pieces probably would have been used. So we were able to do a kind of a reconstruction of that last vignette as well, with very specific instrumentation. Wow. So that's a kind of a snapshot of how we got there.
Wow. So who are the members of the ensemble? And also tell me, have you gotten feedback on the recording? I'm really curious to know about that.
Yes, we've gotten a lot of feedback. I think we have 11 reviews now.
Wow.
Most of them, of course, are on, as many classical reviews are today, are on websites, not in printed media.
Right.
And I think, I tried to frame the origin story of the recording in the opening of my liner notes. And I think many people responded to it, with some circumspection, I guess you could say, but also I think with some respect for how we ended up handling things. The recording came out in January of 2021. George Floyd was, just 6 months or so before, and it remains a fraught topic, these kinds of issues of race. But I felt very strongly that we needed to continue on with this recording. We had toured the program quite a bit. And one of the things that I think came out of conversations in touring that's so important is that many Americans view racism towards Africans and African Americans and the whole sort of original sin of slavery for the United States as a uniquely American issue. And of course, that's not the case at all. And that has to do with the way that we've kind of constructed our history. I had people coming up to me after these concerts saying, I'm really sort of almost apologetic. They were I'm really sort of surprised. I had no idea that there were Africans on the European continent at all in the 16th century. And that's really one of the things that we're trying to set people straight on, that there has been this kind of erasure culturally, historically, but also in the music itself, that these are things that there were in fact composers, not very many of them, but composers in this period of African descent. Vicente Lusitano is the sort of most famous example at this point, because he was a theorist who was fairly widely known among musicologists. But we don't perform a lot of music that represents Black Africans, and we don't sort of emphasize the origins of people if we know them. Because it just hasn't been a subject of much interest to musicologists until fairly recently. And so I think we're trying to undo some erasure here in producing this recording as well.
Yeah.
The texts are they're not free of racism, right? They're difficult. But in the context of, one of the things that I would say is that although Black people come in for more caricature, you might argue, than other folks who are caricatured in the course of this wedding celebration, everybody everybody is roasted. There are songs that make fun of Italians. There are songs that make fun of Germans. And of course, this wedding took place in Munich, right? So there is this atmosphere, as there often was, and as there still is in the after parties of weddings, of just revelry and making fun of everybody.
Right. I'm thinking of like the long, slightly embarrassing toasts that the best man and maid of honor give, or whatever.
Exactly. Complete with all of that sort of innuendo.
Right.
That's subtle or maybe not so subtle.
Right.
I mean, it does make you realize that tradition also goes back a really long way.
Right. Well, this is a really good and an important jumping off point for another thing I wanted to talk to you about. And it's sort of more of like the 30,000 foot view. But, classical music in general has really struggled for a very long time trying to attract new listeners, trying to attract new participants, and I mean, everything from efforts to recruit younger people, to engage with more people of color, to represent the diversity of our world more fully on stage, also, on programs like composers and as well as in the audience, in the back office, in the administrative offices, on boards, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you are a performer, an educator, and a leader of an ensemble, so you are really positioned to have a significant impact on that. Could you share some of your thoughts about how we accomplish that, what you'd like to see in a more perfect world for our outreach?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. And it's interesting that early music has its own particular slant on this.
Mm-hmm.
The audience will have to sort of bear with me for a second. We people who do early music, who study it, who champion it, we have one foot in the camp of sort of trying to right wrongs, or if not wrongs, elucidate performance practices. We spend time struggling about the size of Bach's ensembles, the instruments that he used, the pitch at which he performed, etc. Mm-hmm. Very much in the mainstream, in other words, of what we refer to somewhat erroneously as classical music. But the other thing that early music historians like myself have always done is kind of championed the obscure. Mm-hmm. It's people like us who brought out, Salomone Rossi, the Jewish composer from Venice from the early 17th century. People who kind of exposed, the dustier corners of archives and kind of woke up interest in a lot of music of the distant past. Right. And so to me, there's always been a certain kind of logic in the notion that we would be championing composers who are obscure and have been obscured by lots of things, mm-hmm. by classical music's focus on the classical period and the sort of late Baroque and classical and romantic periods, to the exclusion of much earlier kinds of music. And it has to be said, to the exclusion of the 20th century, right. and now the 21st century. Mm-hmm. We need to broaden that sort of lens. And I think one of the things that we also have to work really hard to undo, and I wind up talking to my music history students about this kind of thing all the time, is kind of to undo the concert norms that have come to us through the Victorian era. The tales, mm-hmm. the absolute, the costumes, the absolute silence, the sort of religious fervor with which we begin and end concerts. Mm-hmm. We need to make these things a little bit less kind of dusty and elitist and a little bit more raw. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another thing that early music is quite good at, because we're giving people these sounds that sometimes are a little bit less refined than we're used to. Mm-hmm. But they demonstrate how instruments were, how performance was, and I think in many ways they come across to people as more real, mm-hmm. and less rarefied. I think that's really how I see broadening the impact of classical music. And then, obviously really working at the things that you mentioned, the programming, the inclusivity. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that's difficult is that sometimes when you're undoing this kind of erasure, as we are in this recording, inclusivity involves drawing in texts and ideas that are really not very nice, mm-hmm. that we have to sort of bring out into the light and show people, even though it's a conundrum, right? Mm-hmm. This, when you to me, when I listen to our recording, the burlesque music towards the end of the recording is nice and fun, but the moresque are the really, that's the really good stuff. There's a lot more rhythmic play. There's a lot more, there's just a lot more interest. And so we have to acknowledge that these are racist texts. It's caricature of a certain kind of people, but that there is also a real quality to the music, a degree of authenticity in that caricature that allows us to view maybe a little bit of who these folks actually were and what their music sounded like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a conundrum.
Right. Right. So what do you think? I mean, obviously it's hypothetical because you don't really know what they were thinking, or maybe you do to some extent from whatever materials were left behind. But like, what was the reason it was this sort of body, sometimes racist, offensive? What was going on? Was that the human impulse to do the roast, as you said, as you called it, or was there something different or more going on?
I think there was a little bit more going on. So if I'm Lasso and I want to make fun of the bridal couple, I want to engage in this roast, I have a couple of issues, right? I work for them and they're members of the nobility.
Right.
So what better way to roast them than to deflect the energy from them and make fun of another group, a group that is in fact so distant from these noble white German people that there's some kind of plausible deniability. No, Mr. Patron, I wasn't talking about you and your new bride. I'm talking about these people of color that are in my song, except that everybody in the room, and remember, they're in the bride's bedroom, knows full well that the caricature also pertains to this noble couple. So it gives, if you like, in the context of 16th century class structures, cover to Lassus while he's making fun of his patrons. And I think that's really the reason. Now, does that at the expense of these people of color? But it also, in a strange way, celebrates the caricature genre as a way to I don't know, I wouldn't go so far as to say stick it to the man, but as a way to have some fun at the patron's expense.
So what other projects does Ensemble Origo have in the horizon?
So we have two other recordings in process, and they were actually, one was recorded much earlier, one was recorded a little later. Around the 500th anniversary of the Reformation in 2017, we did a reconstruction of a Lutheran Mass as it would have been heard around 1530. I think lots of folks think about Protestantism and Luther's adoption of the vernacular in the liturgy as something that happened pretty quickly, when in fact it happened quite slowly. And Luther was a real fan of what we would now consider to be Catholic music, particularly that of Josquin des Prés. And he called Josquin the master of the notes. Luther, of course, was an Augustinian monk. He didn't set out to start a new religion. He set out to reform the Catholic Church. So this recording is a blend of the earliest chorale polyphonic settings by Johann Walter, who was kind of Luther's musical partner, the sort of chief Lutheran polyphonist of the early 16th century, and a mass by Josquin, Luther's favorite composer, that was also the favorite mass in Lutheran parishes. One of my colleagues, Alana Rupstrock, has figured out that this mass, the Missa de Beata Virgine, was the most beloved mass in Lutheran parishes. So we put together that and recorded it, and that is also I hope going to come out within the next year or two. The other reconstruction is also a mass, but this one a full-on Catholic one, and it's the 1530 coronation of Charles V as Holy Roman Emperor in Bologna. And this was a very interesting event because, first of all, Charles V was, he was the last person to be crowned in this way as Holy Roman Emperor. He had colonies all over the globe, and particularly the Americas, were the ones that people were really talking about in the period. So when you hear these liturgical texts saying, he has dominion over the entire world, it's not really much of an exaggeration. And it's a really interesting historical moment. You have the papal choir there because the Pope is the one who's doing the crowning. You have the imperial choir there because the emperor is being crowned. And so there's a kind of a meeting of musical minds. So those are the two projects that are still in the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And I'm working on the very next one, which I hope we'll be concertizing not this year, but sometime during the 2023-2024 academic year.
Ooh, can you give me a hint on what that is, or are you keeping that a secret?
I'm keeping it a little bit of a secret now because I'm deciding between two options, and I'm really not sure which way I'm going to go. Mm-hmm. But I'll let you know as soon as I know.
So this is a little bit of a sort of a personal question, only because I did come through that department there, and I remember there was a little bit of an early music sort of activity, but not much. But yeah. Also a lot has changed in the decades since. So I'm curious to know, and there are schools now that have early music and historical performance departments that didn't. Juilliard is one of them, for example. So how is the University of Connecticut sort of stepping up to that role nowadays?
Well, it's I inherited a wonderful collection of instruments from my predecessor, Bruce Bellingham, who taught here for 30 years almost. Yeah. And I think I'm by myself really as the only musicologist who does music before 1750 as an area of specialization. So medieval and Renaissance music is my real area of specialization, but I do an awful lot of Baroque music and Baroque projects as well. Mm-hmm. And I have a very active collegium that's now kind of folded into the mainstream choral program, and that's very helpful. But I recognize that for most of our students, early music is not really a focus. Mm-hmm. And what I work hard to do is the same thing that I think every classical music conductor or instructor should do, and that's to try to make sure that the repertoire that we're doing, the experiences that people are having, are really relevant to all kinds of things that could happen in your later life as a practicing musician. Mm-hmm. If you are in the collegium and you get to play some recorder, when you're doing those, when you're training your third graders how to play hot cross buns, you know how to do it a little better than most people, and you might be able to give a little bit more context. Right. They're just, every musical experience, I think, has the potential to contribute in a really rich cultural way, not just a kind of a praxis way, something to a practicing musician. So that's what I try to bring to each of these projects that we do with the Collegium Musicum here at UConn. Oh, and of course, I teach music history, so I'm also working with students in the classroom, even if they don't interact with me as performers. And I try again to keep the relevance out there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I've told students, you can ask me anytime, why are we learning about this? And I will give you a direct 2-sentence answer.
Well, that's great. And it seems as though, I speak with a lot of musicians, obviously, people I'm interviewing formally, like we're having this conversation, but also just colleagues and other people I meet through my work, through Sunday Baroque. And so many of them, go into music education or their music education, playing a modern instrument, and then somehow along the way, often in college, somebody puts in their hands the earlier version, the Baroque version or whatever of their instrument, and they suddenly fall in love with it. So yeah, you got to keep that up.
Well, and I try to do the same thing that happened to me. Just give people the experience that makes them fall in love with it, and I think makes them understand the potential of music to communicate in a different way, in an historical way, but really in some ways also the same way as all kinds of music does.
Well, I've been speaking with Eric Rice, musician and music scholar and head of the music department at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. Thank you so much. What a pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a great pleasure.